Hello and welcome to another episode of Gender Stories. I know I'm always excited, elated, delighted, but what can I tell you? I have the best guests, and today I am thrilled to be interviewing Oliver Radclyffe, who is part of the new wave of transgender writers unafraid to address the complex nuances of transition, examining the places where gender identity, sexual orientation, feminist allegiance, social class, and family history overlap. His work has appeared in the New York Times and Electric Literature. He currently lives on the Connecticut coast where he's raising his 4 children. He has 2 books out, two books almost out by the time you read this. Adult Human Male, a brilliant monograph from Unbound Edition Press, which came out last year, and Frighten the Horses, a memoir forthcoming from Roxane Gay Books on September 17th. So by the time you listen to this episode, you can either pre-order or order the book. And if it's half as good as Adult Human Male, I know it's going to be fantastic. So welcome, Oliver. So wonderful to have you here for Gender Stories. Thank you for making the time.
I am so happy to be here. Lovely to see you.
Yes. So I have so many questions for you. I don't even know where to start, honestly, because as I was reading, the first book, Adult Human Male, I was like, yes. I was highlighting, and I wanted to talk about pretty much everything that's in that book.
Yeah, it's a book about gender for sure, let's face it.
It is. And it is a book about gender. And I love the way you look at gender, and that's humans are my special interest or one of them. And gender is definitely part of that. So why don't we start from why did you write the book? I'm always so interested in why writers, why we write the books we write, basically. And so I'm very interested in your motivation, first of all.
Okay, well, it's kind of a weird story, I have to say, because the book that got published first is actually the book that was written second.
Fascinating. Mm-hmm.
So I spent, I don't even want to say publicly how many years writing the memoir that's coming out with Roxane Gay Books in a couple of weeks, or now by the time your listeners are listening.
Yes.
And while I was writing that book, I wanted to write it in a very experiential way. So my journey was from somebody who was living in a completely sort of upper middle class, white, cis-het bubble in England. And I didn't have any understanding of queerness at all. I mean, I really barely knew a single gay person. And then I got married, had 4 children, and then I went through the memoir covers this 10-year period where I first come out to my husband and then to my friends and my family, and I leave my marriage and I have a relationship with a woman, and then I start coming to terms with my trans identity. And I wanted to write that in such a way that it was really showing a cis-het audience what this experience is like, because there seems to be so much misunderstanding about the processes we go through and the questions we ask ourselves and how it actually feels, not the transition itself, because so many people have written about transitions, but what leads you there, the kind of chaos and the questions and the doubt and the confusion and the what is this and who am I and how does this all fit together. I really wanted people to understand that this is what trans people go through. We don't just wake up one day and go, hey, I think I'm a guy, and off I pop to the endocrinologist to get my hormones. So that was my purpose with the memoir, which obviously it took many years to write. It's a 370-page book. It's kind of a big project. But what I didn't do with the memoir was include anything that I considered to be part of the political conversation. I wanted to keep it really personal. So I didn't talk about any of the conversations that are going on. And because I'm British and I live in America, I'm kind of hearing this transphobia coming from these 2 different places, the gender critical feminists in England and then the evangelicals and the hard right over here. And I really wanted to speak. I really wanted to be part of that conversation. And so once I'd finished the memoir and it was off out being submitted, towards the end of writing the memoir, I had started documents that were sort of unwritten essays on my computer. of all these ideas that I had that I wanted to write about. And just as the memoir was being submitted, I got contacted by Patrick Davis, who is the editor of Unbound Edition. And he said, I've read an essay of yours in literature I'd like to hear. Have you got anything more? What are you working on? So we had a 2-hour conversation. At the end of it, he was like, okay, I want you to write this. This is a very long story. I'm nearly at the end.
I love it.
Just
no.
bear with me.
I'm fascinated. I was like, what happens next?
What happens
Oliver,
next?
you're
Exactly.
good.
It's a story in its own, isn't it?
Exactly. I'm ready.
So what happened next was Patrick commissioned me to write this book. I wasn't sure that the memoir was even going to get published because the whole story about how the memoir got published has got its own separate kind of narrative arc. So I thought, well, that's fine. I'll write this book of essays. We'll get it published. And if the memoir doesn't get published, I'll write a novel or whatever. It's fine. And while I was writing and Patrick and I were editing, the memoir then got bought by Roxane Gay Books. So then we were like, okay, we've got 2 books potentially coming out at the same time. Luckily, Roxane acquired it way before she could actually publish because she had like a backlog of other books. And so we said to Grove, look, if we can rush out this adult human male, with at least a year's gap between each book, are you happy for us to do that? And they were like, yeah. So Patrick and I were like, okay, we've got like 3 months to get this book done. But in a sense, that was kind of fun because it meant that I really had to pour all this stuff onto the page. And it's a short book and it's tight, and I had to just like really get it kind of tight and succinct and get all of my feelings about this onto the page. And I think if I had had longer, I might have started to tie myself up in knots about it, because I didn't do gender studies at college. I'm not a scholar. I'm not an academic. I don't have a background in this. These are really just my ideas that have come to me because of the conversation that's going on. And I think if I'd had longer, I might have been consumed by self-doubt.
Yeah.
Like, who am I to enter into this conversation that all of these extraordinary people have been having for such a long time?
But it's such a great book. I'm so glad that I've asked that question because, first of all, this is a great story. So, and you could go for as long as you want. I love long stories. And I think that Gender Stories listeners really appreciate the nuance of the conversations, right? But I really relate to that feeling that if you have longer, like all those other feelings get in the way, right? I remember with gender trauma, it lived for so many years in my head, and that my editor was like, Alex, time to get this book out in the world, right?
Yeah.
And then I was like, okay. And even when I was writing, I was like, oh, am I to write this book? Am I in my lane? Am I not in my lane? And so I can imagine that having such a tight window of 3 months is just like, no, just get it done, get it on the page. And I think that's a gift in some way.
I think it was.
Yeah, one of the things I love about the book, it is that it's succinct. It does weave the political scene with the personal and with the political and the scholarly in this really beautiful and very accessible way, I think, and yet engaging with really complex ideas at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And that is I was like, this is so skillful and wonderful, actually. So
thank you.
I'm even more amazed that you wrote all of that in 3 months, if anything.
You should have seen the state of my office. It was a frightening place in here for a while.
I know that the state of my office is always frightening. So, but people can see it. I keep it off camera, so that's an important thing.
Very wise.
I really want to go back to the first memoir, which is about to come out, really. And like you said, folks who pre-order it already have it. But I want to stay with Adult Human Male for a little bit, if that's okay, because there are so many brilliant things that you have in there, right? Even I was like writing down quotes as I was reading it. And I love kind of the introduction to it is you talk about your mom writing those letters.
Yeah.
And I lived in the UK for 15 years before moving to the so-called United States. And it was almost like I could picture it. if that makes sense, right? I could picture this like your mom writing those letters, and then this moment where, you know, she's asking for like an opinion that your dad would buy into it, which is really, you know, and then you go into this beautiful conversation about how can there be like this neutral opinion when we're talking about like our bodies, our existence, and all of that. How did it feel to kind of have such a almost intimate, almost felt like I was like, you know, looking into through a window into that intimate moment of kind of your mom at the desk writing the letters, and you know, can be tricky sometimes for us to write about our families, and
Yeah.
so as writers, as trans people, so I was curious.
It was really intentional that that was my opening chapter. And the reason I wanted to write about my parents for my opening chapter is because if my parents can get this, then really anybody can. Because, I mean, my parents couldn't be further from the queer community, both emotionally and geographically, if they tried. They really couldn't. And what has been so amazing about my parents is that they have proved that even if there's stuff that they don't understand, they can still accept and love.
Yes.
Across the board. And really they've been like that since day one. And the reason I wanted to put them at the beginning of the book was because I wanted to write the book to people like that, to say it's okay if you don't get a lot of this stuff. It is complex and it is messy and it's new for a lot of people. And I'm not here to chastise you for not understanding, and I'm not here to shame you for not knowing, and I'm not here to be aggressive with you in any way at all. I'm just here to say, hey, this is what is going on. This is what it looks like from our perspective. You're getting it all from the cis perspective because the majority of the journalists who are reporting about our lives are cis, and that filters what people are seeing and reading and understanding. You know, there are a few amazing cis journalists. I will shout out to Lydia Polgreen here, who, you know, just writes as if she knows intimately what's going on. But the cis public does not get enough access yet to trans writers. And it's something that is slowly beginning to change, but we need to be able to tell our stories.
Absolutely. And then those stories also need to be uplifted, right? But often by journalists or mainstream media. And unfortunately, they keep uplifting this more, I would say, sensationalized also versions, right, of our lifestyle,
yes.
you know, and so even kind of gender scholar, I say in air quotes because I think it's questionable, some of the gender scholarship that some of those authors, are putting out there. They are the ones who tend to be really amplified and keep kind of fueling this fire, right? I think what I liked about Adult Human Male is that you take some of those arguments really head on, even just the title, right? Even taking this kind of phrase that is often used by gender critical folks, trans exclusionary feminists, whatever word we want to use for people of like, you know, adult human female and kind of turning
just
it on its head.
Reclaiming
exactly.
that. Yes,
Reclaiming
exactly.
it. Yeah, I love that.
Exactly. And, you know, what I didn't do, thank God, because Judith Butler has just done it far better than I possibly could, is go directly at each of their arguments. And if you read Judith Butler's book, she just tears them a new one in a way that was, I mean, I was like, so there were times when I was leaping up and down with excitement reading this book because she does such a great job. But what I wanted to do with Adult Human Male, rather than counter attack each argument, I wanted to show people how they were being manipulated.
Yes, exactly.
You know, I wanted people to understand that whether whether it's a gender critical feminist or an evangelical Christian or a barstool conservative, what they're doing is trying to create fear.
Mm-hmm.
And when people end up in a fear mindset, that takes over. And that's entirely human. If you believe there is something to be afraid of, that becomes the predominant emotion. And it's very difficult to get through with logic.
Yeah.
And that's the position that we're in at the moment. That's what we're fighting at the moment, is firstly trying to stop these people from, stoking this fear mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, trying to get past that to say to people, this is literally all invented.
Absolutely.
All of these fears, none of these fears exist. None of them. Literally none of them.
Oh, absolutely. And it's so absurd. Some of the, like you said, it's just like the absurdity of some of those fears that get fueled, right? And I love that you talk about, as far as I know, no trans people are trying to eradicate women, nobody, in fact, we're all fighting the same fight for bodily autonomy and sovereignty over our bodies and our reproductive systems. And, what we do with our bodies, it really is about autonomy. And I love how you talk about being the authors, of our own bodies and stories in many ways, right? In the book as well. And, but it's hard because people are so fearful and they're so flooded with this things that speak to some of their core fears, right?
Yeah.
That it's then very hard to have reasonable conversations. And in the book, at one point, you say also, nobody likes being asked to cede authority, particularly to a trans person.
Yeah.
And that I was like, yes, when I read that sentence, right?
Yeah.
Because in my own life, I see that happen over and over. Even sometimes our allies, or people who even care for trans folks in terms of medical providers are much more comfortable with trans people being in the seat of almost objects, right? Objects of care, objects of study. But when we become subjects, right? When we become subjects, when we become authors, when we become scholars or experts, very uncomfortable, even for folks who are like
that's when the
allies, right?
when the transphobia really starts to rear its ugly head, and that's that's the kind of secondary transphobia, not the you don't exist, you're making it all up, or we want to eradicate you, but just I'm kind of all fine with transgender people, but I'm also like really uncomfortable around them.
Exactly.
And in their kind of internal hierarchy, the trans person just gets moved down.
Exactly.
And
as long as you're a little bit less human.
You're a little bit less human. And this is particularly true of trans women. Much more so, I think, than trans men, just because of misogyny.
Absolutely.
There is this sort of automatic mindset that this person must be somehow a little bit deficient.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, why would they do this? And
exactly.
And yet, some of the most brilliant people writing today are trans women. I mean, the most brilliant minds: Andrea Long Chu, Gillian Brandstetter. I mean, these people have extraordinary brains. It's a tough one to get through, and of course, the media is so gatekept. That trying to get, thank God Andrea Long Chu is getting a platform finally, a well-deserved platform.
Absolutely. But it is so much harder, exactly, because nobody's going to cede authority or make space. And sometimes even kind of the voice of our allies, so to speak, kind of supersede the trans, non-binary, gender expansive stories. And that can be really challenging to witness over and over, again, and especially in this moment of rising anti-transphobia on both sides of the pond, really.
Yeah.
I have so many thoughts that I have to just catch one and go in one direction rather than all the different directions I want to go into. And I also love what you say, given that you mentioned Judith Butler. I think at one point in the book, you say something about gender being just this very complex thing that nobody understands, or maybe Judith Butler seems to, but nobody can read Judith. So I was like, yes, that got a really good chuckle.
A lot of people identified with that, I think, between you and me.
I think that was pretty brilliant.
Although
I was like,
yes. This latest book that she's done is not academic.
It's much more accessible.
So,
that is true.
I keep sending it out to everyone. Everyone's like, oh, no, it's Judith Butler. And I know, but I'm saying no, but it's not Judith Butler. It's like kind of accessible Judith Butler. You guys have got to read this. It's really important.
I like to think
their reputation precedes them.
Exactly. I was like, don't be scared. It's okay. This book is
okay. Exactly. Don't be scared.
You will not have to read the same sentence 15 times, I promise.
In order to understand it, I know. We've all been there.
Exactly. I mean, I don't know if I even understood it after reading some sentences 15 times. But yes, this latest book, much more accessible. But I love the point you make that it's like we demand too much from gender. Right? There is like, gender is just this simple one word, but it can mean so many things, right? Identity, social constructs, cultural constructs, right? All this expectation, this taxonomy that we have put on many things. And we could have chosen a different nomenclature, a different categorization, right? For humans. But we put this much pressure on gender. And I'm curious about that. Just some more thoughts about the idea that we demand too much from gender, that we have...
Well, the reason I think that we demand too much from gender is because one of the things that prevented me from understanding that I was trans was that I understood trans as your sex and your gender are not aligned. So if you're trans, if I was assigned female at birth, and I'm trans, in order for me to justify transitioning, I have to be able to say that my gender is male, is like categorically. My understanding was that I had to be able to say my gender is categorically 100% male, and I know this. And that was not my experience. My experience was that my gender was kind of everything. So it absolutely wasn't categorically female, because when I put myself into a heterosexual marriage, I thought I was going to die very quickly. But looking back over my whole life, my gender is very fluid. And it depends what it is, what part of my gender we're talking about. It depends on the circumstances. So, for example, my role as a parent is much more of a mother than a father. My role in the household is much more of a father than a mother. And some people would say those are the same things, but they're not.
Absolutely.
And both of these sides of me are active within that same environment all the time. So what I had to figure out, which is what I figured out during the course of the memoir, is that I didn't have to align my sex with my gender. I had to align my sex with my sex.
Yeah.
So my body is male. And before I transitioned, I would say my body was meant to be male and it got born wrong. And so now I have to fix the stuff that's wrong and align it as closely with the male body that it knows it is supposed to be. Through surgery, through hormones, through, clothes, haircuts, whatever I need to do. And once I understood that, and then I transitioned, I was like, okay, now everything makes sense. Everything makes sense. So when people ask me how I identify, obviously I code switch depending on who I'm talking to. But the truth is, I identify as a gender irrelevant transsexual. Because I really do think that my gender is completely irrelevant. I simply behave how I want to behave. And I do what I want to do. And I speak how I want to speak. And I parent how I want to parent. And I have relationships. All of my relationships are slightly different depending on who the person is. But my transsexuality is real, because that is testament to the fact that in order to feel whole, I had to change my body.
Oh my God, I resonate with so many of the things you said. Also on a t-shirt that says gender irrelevant transsexual now.
Yeah, exactly. Me too.
Because
Me
that's
too.
really
Let's get some of
brilliant.
those printed
I was
out.
like, please, can somebody print like some gender relevant transsexual,
Yeah, yeah, we
Oliver
need that.
Radcliffe quote,
We
because
need that
that's
we
pretty
need that on a
brilliant.
t-shirt.
And I love the simplicity and the complexity of everything you just said, right? Because and there is so much simplicity in how you talked about it because it comes from that authentic kind of lived experience. And there's also so much complexity, right? If we kind of break it down at the same time.
Part of the complexity is that the thing that I really struggled with was everybody around me was saying gender is a social construct, which I understood, and yet I still understood myself as deeply trans.
Yes.
And when I tried to be non-binary, I figured, okay, well, if my gender is non-binary, then surely I will feel comfortable presenting as non-binary. So I tried to be non-binary by having top surgery and, changing the way I dressed, but not going on hormones. And it just didn't work for me.
Yeah.
My body kept saying, no, you have to have a male body in order for any of this to work. You've got to be as male as you can be in order for any of the other stuff to work, which doesn't make any sense unless you reframe this particular type of transness as somebody trying to align their sex with their sex. And I obviously, I'm not beginning to say that this is true of all trans people, but there are obviously so many different ways to be trans. And my particular way to be trans really doesn't have anything to do with gender.
Exactly. And I love, and even if it had to do with gender, it's more about it's just, I love it because my brain is like exploding in 500 different directions right now, right? Because there is like that, what Merleau-Ponty would call that embodied cognition, that way of knowing that you can only know when you're in your body. I knew, I had a fair guess that I wanted top surgery, but honestly, it wasn't until I had it that I knew this feels right in my body, right?
Yeah.
And I have a complex relationship with hormones, but it's really interesting because even the lowest dose of testosterone, my body is just like a duck to water, right? It's like I can be on the lowest dose and I will still go through changes very quickly.
Wow.
Which is really interesting. And so my body knows what it wants, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But again, I did not have that simpler narrative. Maybe, I was not a tomboy as a kid because I have a very queer masculinity, which already kind of confused matters in some ways, right?
Yeah.
And I'm attracted to masculinity regardless of the person's gender. Actually, it's more for me like a role and energy or something that's even hard to describe, right? And so none of this fits into the traditional transsexual or transgender narrative, let's call it, right? Which is why it took me so long, right, to figure it out, even, and why I was so fascinated by this idea of gender, whatever gender is, right? And because there is the physical experience, and then there are all these roles, expectations, expression. But I so relate because the more I masculinize my body, the more comfortable I feel expressing my femininity, in air quotes, so to speak, or like my queer masculinity, right? Because I don't get misgendered as much.
Yes.
And so, because people tend to look at only certain things. And so it is so simple and yes, so complex. And I think that people have a hard time getting their head around it because we, colonialism and white supremacy and Christian supremacy have made gender so rigid.
Yes.
Right. Where there isn't that spaciousness, or even when you said, I was like, I'm very much more like a father in terms of being the main breadwinner, being the, having certain role in the household. But at the same time, I was a gestational parent for one of my kids. Right. And I have that kind of emotional, like, mother-daughter relationship as well as being more of like a dad at the same time. And that can be hard to explain to people, or like, but there is a role and people should fit into just one role because otherwise my brain will explode, basically.
And that is what it's come down to. It's like, it's too much data. My brain can't take all of this. And I get it because it was too much data for my brain too. When I was going through this, I was like, I do not understand what is going on here. the only part of this that I understand is my body needs to be male.
Yes.
But it was like, I felt like I had to have a clear theory of why in order to justify doing it. Like, I can't do this, because there is so much fear about, you're going to make the wrong decision and irreversible changes and regret and all this kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
And what you just said about you didn't know that you didn't know how much you wanted top surgery until after you had it. I mean, I think every single trans person I've ever spoken to has said the same thing.
Absolutely.
Is that you kind of know, but you can't really know until it's done. Then you're like, oh my God, thank God I was right about that. And, when I meet people who are like, I don't know, do I want to, do I not want to? And I'm like, well, okay, how much of your time is taken up thinking about this?
Yes.
Give me a percentage. Is it like above 50% of your day every single day? And they're like, yeah, pretty much. And I'm like, yeah, you probably want it.
That's a lot of energy.
That's a lot of energy. And people who aren't trans do not spend that much time thinking about whether they want to have top surgery or have hormones. And that was what finally got me, because I had top surgery first, a year before I started hormones. And that was what finally pushed me into hormones, is that I was just thinking about it all day, every goddamn day. And finally I was like, I think this is something I want to do.
Yeah.
And then, of course, after the first shot, I just never looked back.
Yeah, and then it frees up so much kind of mental space, so much creative energy, absolutely. And I think that's something that I say also to friends, but also like clients as a therapist all the time. It's okay not to be 100% sure.
Yeah.
Most humans are rarely 100% sure about any decision, even like becoming a parent or getting married or jobs or career. You make a good guess and then you kind of go for it and hopefully works out. And I feel that's a very human experience.
Yes.
And I wonder if we would if it would be so much agony or so much anguish if it wasn't made to be such a big deal, right?
Well, yes, and if it wasn't weaponized against us,
it's so weaponized, exactly.
It is, and that's the danger. Is not only do you internalize that weaponization, that like you're going to make a mistake and you're going to regret it, but also as a trans or non-binary person, I hear a lot of people saying, "What happens if I do it?"
Yes,
and then I kind of want to kind of roll back a little bit. Am I adding to the detransition narrative? Am I betraying my community? Am I reinforcing their belief? Which is crazy, because sometimes you kind of have to like figure out where you're going to land. And sometimes the pendulum of the grandfather clock does swing a little far and then you have to swing back a little bit. That's normal.
Exactly.
And to make that into such detransitioning and you regret and irreversible changes is... it's very detrimental to the freedom that is an inherent part of being trans.
Absolutely. And I think, I believe that you also talk about, in the book, like being trans as a gift, which I also really appreciate and agree with. And I do feel that if we didn't feel that weight, right? And I've worked with a lot of clients who really feel that weight. I need to be a good trans person. So I need to be sure. I need to have no doubt, right? When I make a decision, I'm like, you're asking yourself to not be human. Yeah. It's okay, right? It's okay to have doubts. It's okay to have some ambivalence. It's okay to even, with top surgery, there is some grief when your body changes or some vulnerability that gets in, right? It's like all of a sudden I remember feeling like my heart and my chest was exposed to the world, and like I remember looking down and I was like, what happened to my stomach? Is it like weirdly inflated from, and my spouse looked at me and was like,
you've never seen it before.
Exactly. It was like, so hard news to break to you.
Yeah.
But this is how your stomach has looked all along. You just couldn't see it so directly. And that took me like a long time to get used to it. And I had to keep, especially transitioning older, I had to look at like cis men in their like 40s and go, this is how they look. This is how I look. We kind of look the same.
Yeah.
But, I had internalized so much kind of body fascism as well as, because of the way I was brought up. And so it's just this, almost all this like muck to sort through, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I love about your book is that you seem to go straight to the heart. Like, right?
The muck.
Of the muck.
Straight
exactly.
into the pit of muck.
Straight into the pit of muck. And there is like this beautiful clarity in the complexity.
Yeah.
And I thought that was brilliant. How did you manage that? Was it just like you just went for it, or was it like a conscious process? I'm really curious about that.
I think it's because these ideas had been kind of swirling around my head for such a long time while I was writing the memoir, and they really did want somewhere to go, and they couldn't go in the memoir because they would have ruined the story. The memoir is like it reads like a novel. It's like pure narrative, and putting any of these kind of there are tiny bits of kind of ideological. Slightly, I mean, really almost nothing, to be honest, because it's just story, because the story is kind of wild, to be honest, between you and me. And I don't transition until right at the end of the book, because the book is about somebody who is trying really, really hard not to transition. And everything that goes with that, and all of the kind of processes I went trying not to do that. And when we were speaking 5 minutes ago about the sense of freedom, what eventually happened in the end was when I finally let go of everything, it felt like I had jumped off a cliff or out of a plane. It was absolutely terrifying. I felt like I was like spinning in space because I had nothing left to hold on to. Everything about me that had once been true was now not long. I was no longer heterosexual. I was no longer a woman. I was no longer a biological mother. I was no longer married. I was no longer in a relationship. I didn't even live in my own country. I had at that point been pretty much rejected by the environment in which I grew up, or at least a lot of my parents' friends, if not the younger ones. And so I was like, we don't realize how, this is not answering your original question, by the way. I'm totally going off on a tangent.
Go for it. I love tangents.
But we don't realize how much of a scaffold around us societal expectations are until we take them away. Because we all have, most of us have as part of our internal identity, something external in society that aligns. So you're like, okay, I'm this, or I'm this, or I'm this, whether it's your job or your relationship or where you live or, the hobby that you do. And when you take all of that away and you're just kind of left with no scaffolding, it can be really frightening to start with until you start to realize how liberating it is. And I think the thing that has brought me most joy about transitioning, apart from the fact that every single morning when I look in the bathroom mirror, I see somebody that makes sense to me, is the fact that I feel like I don't belong anywhere, so now I can go everywhere. I don't belong to the trans community is just so, what is the trans community? I don't know. It's just a bunch of trans people, but it's so wild and diverse and, indescribable and uncontainable that it doesn't really kind of make sense as a community, apart from when we're all fighting together against, people who are trying to take away our rights. But now I can be friends with men. I can be friends with women. The way I present makes no sense to anybody. I look like a gay man, but I'm not attracted to men. But I'm clearly not heterosexual. I mean, for God's sake, don't call me straight, because that's the weirdest thing in the world. Nothing about me makes sense. So everything feels right, because I don't have to conform to anything anymore. I don't have to compromise my identity in any way. And, it's one of the reasons why I'm not in a relationship at the moment, because at the moment, I'm taking such pleasure from that. And I know that the minute I enter a relationship, I will have to compromise a little bit. And at the moment, it's like I have waited for years to be 100% myself. And I just want to kind of wallow in this for a while.
Oh, absolutely. And as you were talking, I was like, oh yes, there's just so much beauty in that unraveling, even though it's painful at the time. At least it was for me. Like I
Me too.
related a lot to the, like, you need to let go of a lot of things,
Yeah.
and also to the confusion that people are like, sir, I mean, ma'am, when I open my mouth, I mean, and I'm like, it's all good. That's why I was like, gender irrelevant transsexual. I
Yeah.
feel that is
Yeah.
like 3 words that explain everything. I'm like, yes, I'm for that, because and then people have to get to know you, right? And
Yeah.
it's like, on what other human level do we connect
Yes.
if we take those boxes away,
Yes.
right? What shared interests or experiences we might have, and the expansiveness of that, and that is beautiful in a lot
Yeah,
of
it's like
ways.
that. There's a fascinating Jordan Peterson clip where he's doing his typical thing and he's like staring into the camera, going, if you don't have a gender, how can I connect with you? How do I know you? How can I speak to you? And I'm like, wow, poor Jordan.
Yes,
God, poor guy. That's really rough that he just needs to have his hand held to that degree in order to be able to connect with another human being.
exactly.
It's kind of like, wow, that's really eye-opening.
And I think it speaks to like that kind of toxic cisgenderism, toxic masculinity that tells us like we are going to be safe and we're going to know how to connect if people are in these 2 boxes of male and female. And it's a lie, right? Or we're going to be safe if we put people in those 2 boxes. And it's a lie.
Yeah,
First of all, any femme person knows that no sign on a bathroom door has ever stopped any man assaulting
yeah,
anybody,
yeah.
and we know that intimate partners are the highest risk in terms of violence, and not any person who
People
goes
in
into a bathroom.
restrooms.
Exactly. Which
So
is like
absurd.
absurd, so absurd,
So
right?
absurd.
But I do feel like the sadness in a way, especially for cis white men, where it's like, this is the only way I know how to relate to the
Yeah,
world.
yeah.
And I think that a lot of times it is this fear that the world will explode and they will not understand it anymore.
Yeah.
And in a way, we are proof of that as trans people, because we're like,
Yeah,
yes,
and we do shift the ground under their feet. We
exactly.
can't pretend that we don't.
No, we do.
We do say, look, it's you just do you mind your own business and let us mind ours. But the reality is that we are shifting how society works.
Absolutely. And the reality is that we are a threat to like more dogmatic, colonial, kind of fascist ways of governing bodies
Yeah,
or nations, right?
yeah,
Because we will not be governed by
yeah,
those categories,
yeah.
right? And so we're proof that, like, look, you can actually be who you are. I remember going to my oldest kiddo's school when she was still in elementary school, and a kid was like, are you a boy? And I was like, no. Are you a girl? And I was like, no. And it was like, you got to pick one. I was like, oh, actually, I don't. Nobody has to pick one. Isn't that great? And you could see that it must have been like 6 or 7. This little boy was just like, the wheels were turning, right?
Turning.
Like, oh, and it doesn't matter what people's identity is, right? And I'm sure that some people would feel threatened hearing of an adult saying something like that to a child. But I think it's so beautiful that we can be expansive, right? That
Yeah,
we can be ourselves. And why would we want to put children who are just such amazing, fascinating little beings that are coming into their own, like into this tight boxes, rather than listen to them and be
yeah,
in relation to them as they
yeah,
grow and kind of make sense of themselves. You know
yeah.
what I mean? It's just like, in a way, we are a threat to how society is, but I think in a
But we're a,
good way.
yeah,
Does that make sense?
yeah. I mean, 100%. The point is we're a threat to the power systems that run society at the moment. Okay, we're not
Exactly.
a threat to the little kids because the little kids can open
No.
up their minds in a
Oh, yeah.
heartbeat.
The little kid was like, this is
This is
fascinating. Like,
wild. Exactly. It's like
exactly.
my little next door neighbor when I moved into this house and their kid came running over into our garden and I write about this in the memoir and jumped onto the trampoline with my daughters and she was, I don't know, she was like 5 at the time, 4
Mm-hmm.
maybe. And she just said, my mum says your mum's a man. And my daughter said, yes, he is.
Yeah.
And the little girl was like, oh, okay. And that was it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's that easy. And this is the thing, is that,
Yes.
we as liberals, can't speak to the hard right, but as liberals, we want the next generations to have more, and to have better, and to have wider, and to have greater freedoms and autonomy. And this is part of that. But
Absolutely.
that, obviously that does destabilize these people who think that they're in power at the moment.
Absolutely.
And who
The
are trying to
status
stay in
quo.
power. The status quo, exactly.
Exactly. And I love that example, because I resonate. I've seen it again and again with kids. Like, they get it. It's like, oh, okay, this is what your pronouns are. This is who you are. It's not a big deal. My oldest taking one of their friends to look at the belly cast that I had made when I was pregnant with her. And she was like, see, I told you that my mom is a he and used to have breasts, right? Here's the proof, right? And they were like, oh, cool.
Wow.
And it was like, so, because it's like kids are just trying to make sense of the
Well,
world.
the thing is with kids is that like everything in the world is weird to a kid.
Exactly.
I mean, a tree is weird to a kid. A raccoon is weird to a kid. I mean, everything is like, and what kids do is they look at the adults around them and go, is this kind of part of our world? And if the adults go, yeah, the kid's like, oh, okay.
Exactly.
The fact that they're seeing a raccoon out in the backyard doesn't mean they want to be a raccoon. They're just like, okay, that's a raccoon. And it's the same with the trans and queer people around them. It's like all of those people are trans and queer. So that's something that you get to choose to be if that is something that resonates with you. And if it doesn't, then it doesn't. It's fine. This whole idea that somehow kids are being transed, or the social I mean, it's just all such nonsense. And it really is pure distilled transphobia.
Oh, it really is. And it's so ridiculous. If anything, knowing all the options makes a kid much clearer about who they are. It's like both of my kids have been surrounded like by trans, non-binary, gender expansive people their whole lives. They're very clear about their gender, actually in a much easier way, because it's like, oh yeah, I've seen all these different options.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I see all these options, right? And same with the queerness, is like coming out, then it's not a big deal, because it's just like, oh, this is the buffet of options.
Yeah.
I think these labels might describe me, and I can pick them up and put them down, because I don't have to be my labels. I'm just a human, just like it. In this fenceless, I love that you talk about fences and the fenceless society, right? What would it look, as an abolitionist at heart, who has always hated geopolitical social borders. That really spoke to my heart. I was like, yes, a fenceless society in every way is the dream.
and that partly happened because when I first started transitioning, I was dating somebody who was, I mean, I don't think she would have called herself a lesbian separatist, but that's essentially what she was at the time. She really wanted to separate the women from the men. And if I was transitioning, I was moving out of one camp and into another.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, I absolutely refute that narrative on all levels. None of that is my experience.
And it's such a narrative of separation. I remember even I was brought up as second wave feminist. I used to teach women's studies, but and I used to identify as a dyke, specifically politically. And yet the separatism, I could never get my head around, because I'm like, it's such a rigid fence and it doesn't make sense to me. Even before I expanded, my ideas of gender, thankfully, because it was agonizing to try and deal with my identity. And I was like, it's just internalized misogyny. I'm just not loving myself, right? And then I'm like, no, it's not.
Yeah, no, it's not.
But it's just such a rigid fence that separates us from our humanity to some degree. And I've seen the suffering that some of the more separatist lesbian who then have fallen in love with men, or separatist lesbians who then had to come to terms with like a trans identity, right? That's not easy if you've built your world around this rigid fence.
Yeah.
There's a heartbreak in there.
And also, I mean, I think that what I struggled with a lot at that time, because I was kind of questioning everything, was one of the hardest things I think that I've had to deal with in my transition is the recognition that by transitioning from female to male, I have kind of moved myself down the hierarchical ladder because I'm trans, but I've also moved myself up the hierarchical ladder because I'm male.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to reconcile that in some people's brains. It's very difficult to reconcile the fact that I had to transition because it wasn't a choice. And with that transition comes privileges that I didn't have before, that the people who are the gender that I was assigned at birth do not have. And yet I will fight with every fiber of my body for bodily autonomy and rights for everybody. You know, I'm not just saying, okay, well, I'm fine, Jack, you know, sod you, I don't need to worry about you anymore. It's like, this is my whole life now, is fighting for the right to, for people to be able to do and be exactly who and what they want to do and be. But it is hard for some people to get over that slight resentment of the fact that, yeah, I do. I mean, I pass as a cis man, and that comes with immense privilege. There's just no question about it. It comes with, and, you know, sometimes I'm like, am I so happy now because I transitioned, or am I so happy now because I'm kind of getting all this male privilege that I wasn't getting before? And my trans femme friends, they have the opposite experience.
Absolutely.
And when I say to them, oh my God, I remember having one conversation which I regret in retrospect, after I had transitioned and I had a friend who hadn't, and she was scared and she was da-da-da, and I was like, no, I promise you, once you transitioned, it's all going to feel amazing. And I hadn't factored in the amount of transphobia that she was then going to be subjected to. And that was very eye-opening to witness her go through that.
Yeah.
Was very eye-opening.
Oh, absolutely, because there is kind of the loss of social status. I've supported a lot of folks through that. It's very, very real, right?
And it's not just the loss of the social status. It's also that they become just, you know, fundamentally more vulnerable.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and that comes with a vulnerability. It comes with a level of dehumanizing, right? It comes with like, it's very impactful.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's not just when I say loss of social status, there is so much imbued in there, right? Because in a way it's like, you know, and especially trans women of color, right? I think, and often I find that with trans femme folks of color, there's already an understanding of the system of power, privilege, and oppression. But with some of my white trans feminine folks, it's like, of course, like, right? It's like, it's that, again, that embodied experience of what does it, you know, to be treated in kind of trans misogynistic ways or misogynistic ways. It's really impactful. And being in that liminal space, it's fascinating because honestly, people like read me in all sorts of ways, and then to see how you get treated, and the intersection also with disability, like when I use mobility aids, getting treated again differently, and even in terms of gender, I get misgendered way more if I'm using like a rollerator versus like a cane. It's fascinating.
Wow.
It's just fascinating.
It like really is fascinating, isn't it?
It just
it's
never
like,
ends.
Guys, I'm the same person underneath. I mean, you know, I've had people who, you know, not even acquaintances, just people who I come across in my normal life who just treat me differently because they don't know that I'm the same person that I was before.
Yes.
So my car mechanic, for example, you know, does not know, because I transitioned during the pandemic. They just didn't kind of register that this person who had this car before and was a woman is the same person as this car who has now and is a man. And, you know, it's crazy to, you know, we all know that male privilege exists, but there's nothing like transitioning to get like a really direct experience of that.
Absolutely. To really have that kind of embodied experience, like we said. And I love that you even question whether like, is transition even the right word, right? In some ways, because it's like, I don't know, like, or maybe I was thinking, is transition even the right word when I was reading your book? I can't remember if
I have.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've written more about that
Yeah.
recently because,
Oh.
you know, for me, it felt like alignment. It didn't feel like transition because I didn't transition from
Yes,
female to male because I was never female in the first
exactly.
place. So I just aligned my male body with what
Yes.
a male body is supposed to look like. So, and I think, you know, we use the term transition because it was created by a cis-het
Cis
white
people.
doctor who, and
Exactly.
that's what they saw. What they saw was somebody who was a woman and then became, in fact, in his case, it was somebody who was a man and became a woman, and
Yeah,
that they transitioned across this sort of gender bridge, as it were. But that's just really not how it feels for most of us. You know,
absolutely.
even back as far as we can remember, trans people have been saying, no, there was something wrong with my body, so I just aligned my body with what it was meant to look like.
Yeah. And I love the idea of alignment, because whether people are going through physical changes to align or social changes in terms of pronouns, names,
It works for
haircuts,
everybody.
clothes, we all want to feel more coherent, more
Yeah,
aligned, more who we are, right? And that's all it is. And isn't that such a human experience
it
that
is. And, you
everybody
know,
has?
and this is what feminists have been talking about forever. When we talk
Yes.
about, you know, I was reading a thing about, you know, the sort of metrosexual men from it was the early
Oh,
2000s or whatever,
yes.
when
Oh, my God.
metrosexuality came in.
Yes.
And, you know, what we've been talking about forever is like, you know, let's loosen the parameters that are so tightly placed around men as well. You know, that
Oh,
men, you know, they're not
absolutely.
allowed to cry, they're not allowed to show emotion, there are all these sort of ridiculous rules that they have. It's so restricting and it's so
Yeah,
unfair and it's so deeply damaging for them. And so
absolutely.
when you know, if we could, if everybody could embrace the idea of alignment and take gender out of it, then what you don't end up with is this kind of grey, flat, boring, genderless society.
Yeah.
What you end up with is the opposite, where everybody can be whatever they want to be at any time for any reason and then just change their mind and just do something else. There's complete freedom for everybody. And that doesn't make everybody trans. It doesn't mean everybody needs to go. It just, if everybody, all I want for everybody in the world is for everybody to have access to everything.
Yeah, it makes everybody free.
Yeah.
That's why, I often talk about, like, I don't want an androgynous society. I mean, androgyny is awesome and
Yeah.
hot and,
But nobody's
that's
being the
great.
kind of trans fascist that people we think we are and saying,
No,
right, everybody's got to
exactly.
be androgynous.
Exactly. I just want a liberated world
Yeah.
where everybody, can wear whatever they want and whatever clothes they want, put makeup or not if they want to.
Yeah.
And it's not a big
And
deal.
express their emotions the way they
Yes,
want and choose their
absolutely.
roles within their families the way they
Yes,
want and have relationships the way they want. You know, all of it. Why do
exactly.
we set such rigid rules upon ourselves? And we know why, because of Christian white
Yeah. Well,
patriarchy.
it's a
It
form of
was trying to govern
policing.
us. It was policing. It was trying to govern
Yeah,
society. So we understand. It's just that trying to get people to understand we don't have to do this anymore. We
exactly.
really genuinely do not need to police our society this way anymore.
Yeah.
But people are so conditioned into this type of society. It's really hard to
Oh,
get people to wake up
absolutely.
from that.
It's just so kind of it's so it's in the air we breathe. I often say it's in the
Yeah.
air we breathe. It comes
Yeah.
into our lungs, becomes part of who we are, and it's real hard process on learning that.
Yeah.
If we have kind of if we are part of a culture that is kind of lost that
Yeah.
expansiveness.
And if you and this is why I kind of go, I mean, apart from the people who are obviously sort of violently transphobic, this is why I tend to go easy on cis people who are having a hard time with this because,
Yes.
I am trans and I had a hard time with it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And so if this is who I am and I had a hard time deconditioning myself, imagine if you didn't have that incentive.
Exactly.
Imagine if, it's the same conversations that we were having around anti-racism, back in 2020, I don't know if it's confined to 2020, but, those conversations about anti-racism was like, guys, you really have to understand what is going on here. And it takes a while to like go, oh, okay. But if you're Black, that's urgent. That's like necessary and important. You learn that stuff early and fast and quickly because you have to survive. But for the people who can just calmly go around their lives just ignoring it.
Yeah, it's that protection of privilege.
It's the protection of privilege, exactly. And so, I get it. It's learning about gender and, what in air quotes, and I'm doing very obvious air quotes here, everybody calls gender ideology.
Yes.
For people who don't have a vested interest in that conversation, or for people who, as you say, are going to lose their privilege and power if that conversation becomes too prevalent.
Yeah.
It's trickier.
It is. And, I've even seen trans folks sometimes be afraid of like too much, right? Is it gone too far?
Yeah.
Right. And I'm like, what are we afraid of?
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly.
What are we afraid of? It's we don't need to reproduce the same system.
Yeah, and that's like saying, okay, we don't want to have a fence in here, but we'll put a fence out there. The point is we want no fences. So we really do at this point have to go all out.
Yeah.
And that's, I am behind that 100%. It's just like, we just have to go all out at this place because now is the time.
Exactly. We could be much freer, and we could really, and I think that helps us see also how all of those things are interconnected. Even we just had the Olympics and this constant scrutiny of Black female athletes, right? It's just another reflection of that cisgenderism. And so our struggles are all interconnected, whether it's racial justice, gender justice, reproductive justice, right? Immigration justice, like all the struggles, they're not separate.
They're
really connected.
They really are.
Yeah. Oh, I could have this conversation for like the next 3 hours, but I want to be respectful of your time. And I realized that we got in so much into adult human male because I was so excited to be talking with you about it that we've hardly talked about Frighten the Horses, which is the memoir that is coming out this month in September. So maybe if you do have a few more minutes, I would love to hear the story of your first book, which is about to come out now. Came about because you said, oh, there's a story there too. So if you have the time, I would love to hear it. If not, I'll just have to have you back some other time. But
well, I mean, the story is really that the day after I came out to my therapist as a lesbian, which I kind of knew I wasn't, but was trying to be at that point.
Yeah.
I was married. I had 4 children. I was living here in the Connecticut suburbs. I was living the life of a very wealthy heterosexual housewife. And I was utterly miserable and had been for many years, well, for decades. And when I moved to America, I reconnected with an old friend of mine who was living in New York and had been living in New York for 10 years or so. And she was like deeply submerged in the kind of counterculture, punk, performance art, music scene. And when I came over here and met up with her, it was like the scales fell from my eyes. It's like there's a different way to live, and I didn't know this because I was brought up in such a sheltered environment. And so after nearly having a breakdown, trying to contain all this stuff about myself, because I was heavily in denial and trying to stay. I wanted to stay in denial because I didn't want to blow up this life that I had. I finally came out to my therapist, and then that started this 10-year journey from telling my husband that I was a lesbian to finally transitioning. And I wrote while it was happening. I journaled obsessively. And then started to think, I'd always wanted to be a writer. I didn't think that was something that I could be. I had no idea how that was a thing that even happened. It seemed like completely improbable to the sort of person that I was. But as I was writing more in my journal, to start with, I started writing in the third person because I was so afraid of what was happening that I think I felt that if I could sort of write it almost as if it was a story, I could remove myself from it for a bit. So this memoir started to form, and it took me 10 years from the day I started writing it to the day it got acquired by Roxane Gay was 10 years, because I was teaching myself to write.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have an MFA. I didn't, I had no formal education. creative writing education had finished when I was 16, because there's no creative writing in your junior or senior
Yeah.
years at school in England. So it was a very, very, very long process. And at many points during that process, I really didn't think this thing was ever going to get published. But that kind of almost stopped being my aim. By the end, my aim was I need to have written the book that says exactly what happened, that is really deeply truthful about what happened. And that includes not just the journey, but everything that I went through and everything that I was responsible for, and all of my shame and all my weakness and the bad decisions that I made, and, all the kind of humanity of it, and the confusion and the chaos and the fact that other people were damaged. But because I'm English, everything is written with a sense of humor, because that's what the English do. It's like, if something's really tough, let's just kind of make a bit of a joke about it. So it's very much written in that style where there's kind of wit and humor, but there's some fairly dark stuff going on there as well.
Yeah.
So, and just as I was about to start submitting it, Roxane Gay announced that she was starting this imprint. And she said in her announcement, "I'm probably not going to be interested in sad white people marriages." And I'm like, oh.
You're like, great.
I'm like, great. Okay, that's kind of the whole first part of the book. But okay, maybe I get a pass because I'm queer and trans. And thank God I did. Thank God. I mean, this is the first time being trans had actually worked in my favor. Because previously, when I was looking for an agent, agents were turning me down because it's like, oh no, we've already got a queer or trans writer.
Yeah, we've already got one of those.
Yeah, we've got one of those. And I'm like, oh, sorry. Bit too late to the game here. So yeah, this was the first. I don't know whether that's why she bought it. Obviously, I'd never asked her. Yeah. So, and obviously being published by Roxane Gay. I mean,
oh, what an honor! I mean, and I'm sure she got it because it's brilliant, right?
And she did get it. I mean, oh my God, the editing process was so easy.
That's great.
She got exactly what I was trying to say. She knew exactly what we needed more of. She knew exactly what we had to cut out. I mean, it was like, oh my God, I'm in the hands of an expert here. She 100% got what I was trying to do with this book. And she just, moved it up that extra level in the editing process. It was amazing. It was really fun.
That's amazing. I'm so happy for you. And I so understand when you were like, there's just like this Highlander syndrome. We already have a trans person. We already have a trans memoir. I'm like, that doesn't work like that.
Yes, exactly. There's not just one of us,
No, exactly. That's one of the reasons why I love publishing my nonfiction with Jessica Kingsley, because they have so many trans authors, actually. They're really cultivated, like a whole stable of trans, non-binary, gender expansive trans authors, and it doesn't feel like that tokenizing that I've experienced so much of in academia. So I'm so happy that you had such a great experience with the book that just about to kind of come out into the world.
It is just about to come out into the world, and it's got some great pre-pub reviews, and it was on the best recommended for fall with Oprah Daily and with People magazine. So it's just so exciting to start getting feedback from it, because when you're someone like me, I've just been writing into the void for the last 10 years with no idea what anybody's going to think about this book. And my beta readers are all my friends, so while I trust them to give me good feedback, they're also going to be saying, they're cheerleaders as well. Exactly. So there's a little bit of like, I kind of know you like it, but you're in it, so you probably like it because you're in it, So it's really really fun getting feedback from people who owe me nothing.
Yeah, it's so satisfying, absolutely. I completely understand that feeling of like, oh, I don't know how this is going to land. And then when absolute strangers say nice things about my nonfiction books, I'm always like, oh, that's amazing. Wow. Like, this person I don't know has gotten all of this out of these things I've written in the isolation of me and my computer, So it is a beautiful moment. Well, like I said, I can't wait for Gender Stories listeners to read both of your books, actually, both of your brilliant books. And I could keep having this conversation, but I will be respectful. And so I'll ask you the question that I always ask at the end of my interviews, which is there anything we haven't talked about that you were hoping we would touch on or talk about?
I did not know you were going to ask that question.
Oh,
So
sorry. I usually say it before recording, but it's like, take the time you need.
No, it's just like, I feel like we've covered so much in this conversation. I feel like we kind of went there.
Yeah, we did.
So I honestly, I don't think there is. I think
great.
all I would like to say is, if you want to read my more kind of academic thoughts about gender, pick up Adult Human Male. But if you just want a crazy story, pick up Frighten the Horses, because the story is kind of crazy.
Well, we live in a very, crazy world in that context of mad pride, right? It's a world that doesn't make sense. And so how could our stories not be that in a lot of ways? But, you could also read both, because they're both brilliant.
Or read both,
I'm
exactly.
Just saying,
I mean, they kind of go well together, let's face it. It's a little bit like a main course and a dessert,
Exactly.
Exactly. I would say that Adult Human Male is the main course, and Frighten the Horses is the dessert. Yeah,
I love it. So they came out in the right order in some ways,
so,
right?
Yeah, they came out in the right
before
order.
Dessert.
Exactly. There you go.
And, given that, I took you by surprise with that question, maybe let's just end on, how are you finding joy or comfort in these days of rising transphobia on both sides of the pond? What gives you joy nowadays? No matter how small it is.
I think what gives me joy is, honestly, it's the writing. It's finally having the confidence to know that I have finally developed the skills to say what I want to say, and that I'm not going to run out of things to say. Because there was that kind of strange writer's feeling of like, okay, I've got these ideas for these essays, but once I write them, what happens if that's it? Or I've got this memoir, what happens if I write it and that's it? But I've already started on a novel, which I'm very excited about. And the ideas for the essays just never stop coming. And having spent 10 years conducting my own personal MFA in gender studies and reading every single book I can get my hands on, and reading all the novels, teaching myself about structure and style and all the rest of it, I have a lot more confidence now in my writing, which is a really nice place to be in, because to start with, I was like, I know I love writing. I know I have a kind of a vague innate talent, but how does one develop the skill, and how far can one develop that skill? What is going to be my ceiling? And now I'm feeling like, I think my ceiling might just keep moving up, and I'm hoping that just each book will be just slightly better than the last.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I think that's what brings me joy.
That's beautiful. I love it. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I don't have an MFA either, and I've got my PhD in what used to be women's studies, actually, not even gender studies, but I know that feeling of like, is anybody going to get this? And is anybody going to read this? And just the joy that comes. But then we do it because sometimes it's just that joy in the writing process.
Yeah, in the writing process, exactly. Yeah. I mean, just getting a sentence right.
Yes.
It's so little, but there are some sentences that are tricky, and I can work on them for a while, and then suddenly I get it right, and it's like, that's exactly what I wanted to say. I know that sentence has nailed it. I know it's saying what I want to say. I know it's communicating exactly what I'm feeling, and that is a really, really great experience. That's the mindfulness of writing.
So beautiful. And if people wanna, of course, people can order your books at any independent bookstore. But if people wanna kind of follow you and find out more about your writing, do you have like a website or social media where
I
people
do.
could follow you?
My website is just my name, oliverradclyffe.com. I also have a Substack called Brevis Scriptor. So if you look up Oliver Radclyffe, hopefully it will take you to Breve Scriptor. And I have Instagram, which is the only social media that I do. I think it posts on Facebook, but I do not understand how. I once opened up Facebook recently and I'm like, oh my God, this is terrifying. I just closed it down again. I do not understand what's going on with that site. So yeah, I'm an Instagram person.
Fantastic. So we'll make sure that all those links and all those handles are in the episode description, dear listeners or viewers, if you're watching this on YouTube. And Oliver, thank you so much for this. I feel nourished by this conversation and I feel so grateful. And thank you for sharing the joy of your writing with the Gender Stories listeners and viewers. I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been an absolute delight.
And dear Gender Stories listeners or viewers, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. And I hope that you find that beautiful freedom no matter what your gender identity is. And until next time.